You are listening to The Catholic Wire.
He insisted that we be taken out of the parochial school because of what was appearing in the catechisms that we were being given by the sister. And I know it was hard on my parents, and it makes me cry sometimes. He had been pretty much ostracized from the diocese because he wanted to stay with the Latin Mass.
But I mean, everything started changing, and I was so confused with what was going on. The things that were coming down, the teachings from the Vatican, from the Pope, was whatever you want to do is okay.
Afternoons, and he said, I want to go to confession. So he went in, he came out, and he goes, that was really weird. On the 23rd came in, he said, this is not good. This is not a good man.
Huh.
Not even being a Catholic.
In the last decades, many Catholics have experienced terrible moral persecution. Their faith, their traditions were taken away from the churches. Many have lived for many years ignorant of the deprivation they suffered. Some are still going through that painful and at once beautiful process of rediscovering the Catholic faith. For the encouragement of those still in that journey, faithful Catholics have shared with us their challenges, trials, and blessings. This is the story of their journey back to the faith. Hello and welcome to Back to the Faith. This is your host, Father Cepeda, and I am here today with Agnes and Jim. They're parishioners from Denver, and we go back a couple years. One day Agnes showed up in Omaha, and she brought to us a border boy, and we had the pleasure to work with them, and after that we had been working together and just having a good friendship for a long time. And so thank you Agnes and Jim for being here with us today.
Pleasure.
You're welcome, Father.
And I think you have an interesting story as well about your journey to the faith. Who would like to begin?
I think I'll go first because my story is shorter.
Okay.
When I was 13, 14 years old, my parents were always very conservative, and my mother became acquainted with the Fatima cell program and got involved with that with a couple of other people from our hometown. And every week they would meet and have these meetings discussing issues of the faith and points of devotion. And there was always prayer before and after, and always a little social period following that. And so very early on, she had her eyes open to what was going on in the church. And in 1967, one of my older sisters gave herself heart and soul to the traditional Catholic movement. And of course my mom followed my older sister and brought us younger kids along as far as learning the faith. And my younger sister and I went to school out in Coeur d'Alene and finished our high school education there. And so for me it was really a pretty easy transition. I had attended some of the modern services when we were going to the parochial school in Montana. This would have been 66 to 68, something like that. And they were revolutionary, really. My dad was not a Catholic and never was baptized. He was in the John Birch Society, which is
okay.
Yeah.
So he would know perfectly well.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about my dad was a good man, and he always really revered the popes. He highly respected them, especially Pius XII for his action in World War II, trying to sort out that mess. And when he died, and John the 23rd came in, he said, "This is not good. This is not a good man."
Huh.
Not even being a Catholic, he recognized that this guy's going to steer the boat in the wrong direction. I thought that was interesting.
Wow.
Yeah. And he also said that it was the Freemasons who were behind the communists, which is also, recognition that a lot of people don't reach.
Yeah.
But he insisted that we be taken out of the parochial school in 1968, fall of 68, because of what was appearing in the catechisms that we were being given by the sisters and the priests, that were strongly influenced by the communist, socialist, that sort of flavor. So,
like what kind of stuff would you see?
The two things that I remember in particular were three things. Pictures of Martin Luther King Jr. and his message in our Catholic Catechism. A picture of the SDS, the Students for Democratic Society, all standing, standing and singing around a bonfire. And then the music and lyrics for We Shall Overcome, which was when the priest would come and have the catechism class with our 7th grade group once a week. We learned these songs, and he sat on the teacher's desk and played his guitar, and we sang along. We shall overcome. Yes. So that last year, I was in 8th grade. My dad insisted that we be taken out of the parochial school and put into public school. So that was it. As far as our involvement, we stopped going to the services there in Montana, and when they opened a school out in Coeur d'Alene, that was where we went and finished our education.
Something like that happened to my siblings as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they were in a Catholic school as well. It was a very famous Catholic school in Mexico, huge one. Mm-hmm. And same thing. My dad just went at one point, and public school in Mexico is bad. I mean, it's like communist public school. There's no midterm, and he said the same thing. He said, take them out because I'd rather have them somewhere where at least I can tell them what they teach you there is wrong. These are communists, than having them somewhere where they would claim to be Catholic, and they'll be even more confused.
Still pushing that same agenda. Yeah.
So you mentioned the Fatima cells.
Yes.
Did those begin even before the council?
No. As far as I know, the Fatima cell program began, I'm just going to take a jab and say 1965, because I believe they were the outline for the program was in place. I know when we became acquainted with it.
Okay, so that was during the council.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, so it was lay people. It was a program for lay people to meet and discuss issues of the faith.
Now, would you mind explaining? You were explaining before to me, and I think people would find it really interesting, like what they did in the Fatima cells.
Okay.
I think that would be interesting to know.
Okay. Well, in our little town, there was my mother and I think 3 other couples, and I can only think of 3 other children of these couples. Okay, so it was a very small group. Mm-hmm. But the parents would meet, say, every Tuesday night. They'd get together they would kind of cycle through the houses. The one I remember, the Guilfoyle's house, we would go there, and they would start with the rosary. So there was a publication that came out, I think it was 3 times a year, and it was the forerunner of the current Reign of Mary. I don't remember its name. But it would have a program, very clearly outlined program. Week 1, say March, week 1. Begin with the rosary. Have a meditation on the life of Saint Joseph from this book, pages 15 to 19. And then you said your prayers. Then you started with your first little report, like a book report. So say Mr. X had read encyclical of Pius the 11th on Christian education. So he would have read that beforehand, and prepared a 5 to 10 minute just discussion of it. At the end of the discussion, there would be questions and answers for another 5 minutes, and then they moved on to another devotional topic, which maybe Mrs. Y had prepared. And again, the materials for the discussion were provided in the cell program, and they say it was on devotion to St. Joseph because it's St. Joseph's month. So maybe she had read a little pamphlet about him that was prescribed. She discussed it. There would be questions and answers. And then it would conclude with some prayers and then a little social half hour. And this was weekly. This was totally the lay people. In our case, there was no traditional priest in our town. So it was entirely among the lay people, learning their faith and praying together.
Wow, that's pretty awesome. That also reminds me of the Cristeros during the persecution. That's what they did. That's how they teach catechism to the children. So you went to the school in Mount St. Michael's?
It was before Mount St. Michael's.
Okay,
Yes.
but it was in Spokane?
It began in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho.
Okay.
And then they purchased the city of Mary, and so this little school moved up there.
Okay, and that's where you went to high school?
Yes.
Now, when your family, if you don't want to answer any question, just that's fine, totally fine, or we can cut it later.
Sure.
Or I can tell you I'll cut it and I really won't. No, but when your mother decided to follow your sister and to join the tradition,
Yes.
can you tell us a little bit of the difficulties that you had, perhaps? Did they have difficulties with the other members of the family?
Well, because it was just my younger sister and I. The older ones had grown and gone.
Okay.
And I was going into high school, and my younger sister was going into 6th grade. When all this, as I said, my dad, not being Catholic, but being very conservative, I believe this was his concern as much as it was my mom's. And so together they were looking for a place for us to go to school. They were actually talking about some school, I think it was in Iowa or Illinois. It was someplace back east. Mm-hmm. Sounded very romantic to me as a 14-year-old, go off to boarding school. And so that was being discussed. I remember hearing this. Our bedroom was up above the living room. It had a little register in the floor, and I could, lay on the floor and listen to Dad and Mom talking about our futures. But then when the sisters in Coeur d'Alene decided to start a school, they said, well, Coeur d'Alene's only like 4 hours away. So instead of sending them off to boarding school, Mom went with us. Mom and my sister and I moved out a little tiny cabin in Hauser Lake in Idaho. Mm-hmm. And so we were there for the school year. So we would be there, say, 4 weeks, and then we'd go home for a long weekend. And Mom would make meals for Dad and freeze them, and we'd say, I don't want to go back. And then Mom would put us in the car and take us back. So yes, there were difficulties that way, and I know it was hard on my parents, and it makes me cry sometimes to think of my dad being all alone in that big house, after having had a big family of kids, and here he was frying his eggs, flipping pancakes for himself. Wow. Of course, we spent our holidays there, summers, when there was no school, but that was a cross. Mm-hmm. For everybody. Yeah. But that's what they wanted. That's what Mom and Dad wanted.
Had they seen anything go on, like in the church itself, besides the schools, or not really?
Well, we had the children's masses, which I think they were maybe once a week, maybe once a month, but they were little wild scenes compared to the traditional mass that we'd always gone to. And so on the days that they had the children's masses, we would always be sick in the morning and arrive at school, in the afternoon, which meant we went to the park and played or something. Wow. She'd just pull us out of those.
Okay.
Yeah.
If I may ask, who was the priest when you were in high school?
There was a traditional priest, or a priest in the Spokane diocese. Father Joseph Pineau, Pineau. I never saw a French word spelled out before, so that caught my attention. Okay. And he had been pretty much ostracized from the diocese because he wanted to stay with the Latin Mass. Okay. So
at this time, was there any link with Bishop Ivaronas and all the people from the?
Oh no, no, he was too young.
Oh, okay, so this is interesting.
He didn't arrive on the scene until 72, maybe 71, 72.
Whose school was this where you were at, though? That was Bishop Schuchard?
Yes.
Okay, and this priest was connected to Bishop Schuchard or no?
He was just a priest from Spokane that our people became aware of. And we're not talking Bishop Schuchard, we're talking Brother Francis.
At that time, okay.
Yeah, yeah. So, let's see. So we went from Father Pinot, I think Father Clement from
Clement Kubish?
yeah, from Omaha. I think he came later on in the scene. It's all kind of jumbled in my mind. But then, we started getting our own priests.
Yeah. Bishop always talks about Father Clement Kubish. He'll bring him up. Actually, in the last program, I had a story about Father Clement Kubish.
Oh, good.
But I didn't remember his first name. Do you remember anything else about Father Pino? Like what he had to go through,
I really don't know. I was a 14, 15-year-old.
Okay, but he stayed to the traditional mass?
Yes, he did.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so you were in Denver then. You moved to Denver.
Yes, when I moved to Denver, I immediately inquired whether there was a Catholic, a traditional church there, and located Our Lady of Victory in Aurora. And then, during that time, Jim and I met and married. And then some of the people from the original Our Lady of Victory Church in Aurora were having difficulties with the priest. And they called Bishop Pivrutis and said, we need help because this just isn't working. It wasn't a good situation.
Was he a bishop already at that time?
Yes. This was, probably about 2004. So he started sending a priest over for masses. I don't know how frequently, because with Jim's history, I didn't want to start taking him to a hotel room here, and a banking office there, whatever, to go to Mass. So as long as we were going to St. Isidore's, the Pius X Church, we had a church. We had, priests. It was very regular. And I just didn't want to do that. Mm-hmm. So the Bishop Pivrutis started sending a priest over there. I think it was once a week. And they rented. And they had a Mass in a rented place. After 2 or 3 years, they purchased what we have now, Our Lady of the Snow. Mm-hmm. And, I'd been in touch. I know all these people in the different parishes. And I was called and said, Bishop is going to consecrate our church tonight, or bless our church tonight. It was the Feast of Our Lady of the Snow 2007. And so Jim and I went that night, and then that's where we went ever since then. We were just waiting for them to get a solid basis, a permanent structure, so that it felt permanent.
Okay. Before we go into that story even more, but I love that look in your face. Maybe, I don't know if you want to tell us something about how did you come to find the faith?
Well, I'm 80 years old. I've been a Catholic since I was 10. And my story is I grew up without a father in the home. He left my mother when she was pregnant with me. And so I never had any knowledge of God, really. During my first 8 years. And me and my 2 brothers, we ran the streets, urchins, just doing whatever we wanted to do. Mm-hmm. I started when I was 6 years old and getting into a lot of trouble. And just never had any foundation, no authority in the home, no knowledge of God. And so just, heading willy-nilly, to hell in a handbasket, as the saying goes. The Chamber of Commerce in this town that, we were kind of tearing apart sent us, to the boys' home up in Nebraska, Father Flanagan's. And I was 8 years old. My 2 brothers were 10 and 12. And the first thing there, you're not forced to go to church, but, they make the opportunity to where you can go to the Protestant services, which were held in the field house, corner office in the field house. And then they had the Catholic church up on the hill. Well, I went to, started going to the Protestant services, and I can't remember anything about it, but it was, had no appeal to me. It was just, someplace, I had to spend some time. But I always looked at the Catholic Church on the hill. And so I went up there one day, and I liked what I saw. It felt good, felt like the presence of God was right there. And I liked the ritual, and I liked, everything about it. It just had meaning for me. Mm-hmm. And so when I was 10 years old, I decided to become Catholic. And so I, got catechized and became Catholic, and I became, an altar boy right away because I liked to just immerse myself in it because it was so rich. Mm-hmm. And felt so good. And so...
this was what, 19?
This was in 1951 is when I became Catholic.
The golden years of the church in America, pretty much.
Yes, yes. It was just... It gave me meaning, and it was like direction and discipline. Mm-hmm. And it just, something to really enjoy and hold on to that was, very meaningful. And so I'm 80 years old now. I still serve Mass, and it's stayed with me. But I had some dark days along the way. And when I was 24 years old, I had just gotten out of the service, and I was going to Mass 3 or 4 times a week to the Catholic Church in Omaha, and I would serve Mass, sometimes there. And then, this was 1964, 65. Then everything just all of a sudden, it's like I had a stroke or something. I didn't, but everything started changing, and I was so confused with what was going on, in the Mass, the service, and the way everything went on. They would bring guitar players in, and a lot of strange events going on that, just became, to me, very disturbing, very ugly, I thought. And so I just stopped going to church altogether. And then I moved from Omaha to Colorado. I never went to Mass. I just kind of dropped out. And it took me 29 years before I was ever to come back, because I didn't know that tradition was still alive, that what I loved as a child growing up and serving, Mass was still alive. I thought, if this is what they're going to do now, I don't understand it, and I don't want to be part of it. So, I stayed in Denver a few months, and then I moved to California. And in California, same thing. I never had any desire, to go to the new church, the new order, because it had, lost all its flavor to me, meaning. I felt out of touch with God, and so I just started doing whatever I wanted to do. No connection to God anymore. It's like I was just a lost soul, and I would ended up after a while going to homeless shelters and living first this one and then that one, and then I just I couldn't see any meaning in my life, so I just wanted to get out of that because I felt really like the story of the prodigal son. And I asked my brother, who lived in Denver, if he could take me and help me to get back on my feet and get stabilized. And talking to him, he eventually said, boy, he gave me a chance, but I had to really toe the line. And so he took me in and helped me to get a flight to Denver, and he picked me up, and I could see him walking around the airport, kind of looking me over, see, what he was getting into. Well, he took me home and, gave me a place to stay. And then the first week, he took me to Mass, the traditional Mass, where Agnes went. It was Our Lady of Victory. And it was the first inkling I had that there was still the old glorious traditional Catholic Church alive and well in spots. And so he introduced me to Agnes, and that was the grace of God, because as it ended up, she helped me save myself, because I was going nowhere. And so, after 29 years, to find something, that I had known in my childhood and early years that was still there. Mm-hmm. I thought the golden thread had been cut and I'd never be in touch with it again. So he asked Agnes if she could take me off his hands for a day. And it was like, for me it was, she was solid and had, her feet on the ground and established in the traditional church. And I liked that, and I fell in love with her. Love at first sight, really.
There was some gradual sort of introduction back into tradition, in that within, a couple of months after we met, Jim ended up in the hospital with his ulcer, and the hospital happened to be right across the street from where I worked, so I would go over there during lunch and sit with them. And one day I went over and he said, "You'll never guess what I did today." And I thought he was going to say, "I got to walk down the hallway, with my IV or something like that." And I said, "Oh, what did you do?" And he said, "I went to confession." Well, what it was the chaplain at the hospital had gone around and met Jim, and Jim said he wanted to go to confession. So the priest said, "Sure." So he sat down, and they covered the last 29 years, and the priest said, "Now, for your penance, just, thank God, say thank you, God, that, that you've come back." And so when he told me this, I was like, oh my goodness.
I said it was really strange.
Yeah, he said it was really strange.
And that's not the confession that I had known.
Yeah. And then, so that was the first kind of, it's like the wires were crossing. He's seeing traditional and the new kind of at the same time. And then we went for a drive one Saturday, and this Queen of Peace church had the sign out that said confession Saturday afternoons. And he said, "I want to go to confession." I said, "Be my guest. I'm going to walk around the Stations of the Cross out here." So he went in, he came out, and he goes, "That was really weird." He sat down in the chair, across from the priest.
Like we are right now, pretty much. Yeah.
Yep. And he said, "That was really weird. I'm never doing that again." So there were like 2 or 3 times that, during this little stretch of time, that he'd say, "That was really weird. I'm not doing that again." So there was a little bit of a gradual introduction, but for the most part, he came in, with both feet.
Yeah, it took time, when I was going to the traditional church, where I would get back and go to a real confession. Mm-hmm. And, the way that I was brought up, and, it helped me get a little bit more established. And I was courting Agnes for probably a year. And Agnes told me, she says, I like you, Jim, a lot, but, I want to get married, and I want to go to heaven. And then we, talked to Father Barry at Our Lady of Victory, and, he saw that there was no impediment.
So I was going to ask something else. How was the step for you guys, for you all, I should say, because we're in Arkansas, into realizing that the Holy See is vacant? I don't want to say sedevacantism, because we're Catholics. We're only Catholics. There's no labels there. But, did you struggle with that idea at all? Or was it just like something natural that, it was easy to understand?
I never struggled with it, because that was the way that I was taught from the beginning, from the time that we left the Vatican II Church in 1969. was, within a couple of years, it was like this. They can't be Pope.
Mm-hmm.
And I was a kid, so.
Because that's what with what you were saying about the confession, going to confession here and there. That's something that a lot of Catholics struggle with when they come to tradition. They kind of have the idea still that you have kind of like the conservative. They see it almost like a conservative church and a liberal church, but they were both in the church, so to speak. And I've seen that a lot in some people that they'll kind of think of both of them as Catholic church, and there is a problem for sure. I mean, one of them is not Catholic. That doesn't mean that everyone there doesn't want to be Catholic. Most people in there want to be Catholic, mm-hmm. but the hierarchy and what they do and the teachings that they have and the sacraments that they have, they're not Catholic anymore. I remember one time we were driving to Nebraska and we stopped at this church, and out of curiosity, I always try to go and see what they have. Mm-hmm. Usually the churches are very beautiful too. And in one of they had a pamphlet for confession, and so I looked at the pamphlet for confession to see what they said. In the pamphlet of confession, it had like the 10 commandments, and for the 6th commandment, the question that you were supposed to ask to yourself was, have I been faithful to my sexuality? That's like, are you kidding me? It's like, this is more inciting you to sin that
really, truly.
Yeah, it's like, to me it was mind-boggling. Just thinking like, oh, who's going to read that and confess? It's like, that's horrible. That's horrible. Gosh. And that makes me think of, confession in there is, as you probably experience, you sit down in front of the priest and it's more like a talk, really, and there's no sense of the tribunal where you're supposed to be, where the priest is the judge. He's just giving you absolution for your sins. Mm-hmm. He's not like the psychologist, right. talking to you. So I think that step of trying to realize the Catholic Church is not divided in liberal and conservative, but mm-hmm. there's just one Catholic Church and the other ones have deviated from it. It's kind of a hard step to take.
Uh-huh.
Well, what I grew up with basically was Pope Pius XII. Had this sanctification, which is the same thing that I was seeking all my life. Was to, through the grace of God, reach sanctification and be qualified, to be with God forever. And it's like one thing I didn't like about the Protestant church was that it was more based on man than God, and not God directed. And I found that as the church changed from tradition to Novus Ordo, the new order of things, it was the same thing. It's like the things that were coming down and the teachings from the Vatican, from the Pope, was whatever you want to do is okay, mm-hmm. rather than based, on the teachings of Christ. Mm-hmm. And it just was willy-nilly. And I'm thinking, well, how can this be? I mean, people are putting themselves in the place of God, and it's like changing what Jesus' teachings were to just go along with the times. And I'm thinking, well, so much of that to me was heretical. And so I'm thinking, well, the vicar of Christ on earth, I question that. I mean, the authority is there, but they're getting off the path of the Good Shepherd, away from that.
I'd like to ask you, I don't want to hold you too long, but I'd like to ask you 3 questions that I'm going to ask to people in this in this program every time. One is, what was the hardest thing, the most difficult thing in your journey to the faith, or in your journey through tradition? What has been the most difficult thing? The other one is, what is the greatest blessing that you had, the thing that you're most thankful for? And the third question would be, what's your advice for young people, for the young generation that is coming? As I was telling you over there, a lot of the young generation, they never had that struggle. They never had that moment where they were taking the faith and the church away from them. So for them, it's kind of like, it's almost they don't have that spirit of fighting because they never had to deal with that violence. But you have lived through those changes. You know how hard it was for some people. For what you're telling me in your life, that was like it was all connected to the faith, really. When you lost the church, that was a problem for you. And when you found the church, that was your coming back. So first, what would be the greatest, the thing that was more difficult about this whole...
Well, for me, it was like there was an anger that just kind of rushed into me to think that I've lost 29 years of my life, that was going along smooth from the time I was a child and the time I made a choice, to go with the traditional Catholic Church that's been around for 2 millennia, to have it change so dramatically and drastically and ugly, really. So dealing with that, I felt cheated. And so I had a lot of anger in me still that I had to deal with. And the thing that I really enjoyed the most, or felt, really good, was I felt like I was back with God's grace once again, and there was hope for my sanctification. There's a pathway that I could return that I had early in my life and lost. So the hope to going forward is that, I'm more in touch with God, whereas I didn't have that connection, for 3 decades almost.
And what advice would you give to the young generations?
Well, I would say that they have to learn to really accept God's grace in overcoming any obstacles that they have, and to learn more about the tradition of the church and everything that's been taught down through the ages, and to the catechism that's involved, and all the teachings of the church, and find out as much as they can about it, and what went wrong throughout the years, mainly, in Europe, with people like Martin Luther King going and rebelling against it. Understand what it has happened, to bring the church, and also to find out about who were the people that infiltrated the Catholic Church to change it from what it was to what it became in the 60s. The 60s there was so much going on, and it was a perfect time for people that infiltrated to work their poison and to, teach people things, that were opposite of truth.
Yeah.
So anymore, it's like, people are so confused about what really is up and what really is down, They got everything turned inside out. So it's like, go to an established theology, religion that is the Catholic Church, traditional Catholic Church, that has held on to all the tradition, that has been a stronghold against the devil for, like I mentioned, 2 millennia. And it goes right back, to Jesus Christ and his teachings, not the teachings of men.
You lived through those changes too. You were in the 60s. You were like right in your teenage years, so you saw it all firsthand.
Yeah, teenage years, into the 20s.
Yeah.
And so the strife that was going on at that time, we had our leaders being assassinated. You had the church falling apart. You had the wars, Vietnam War, and the sexual revolution, they called it. And it was just like so much turmoil, devil was licking his chops because people didn't know, which end was up anymore.
Yeah.
And what to hold on to. And, the pathway to heaven.
Yeah.
They lost it.
How about you, Agnes? What was the hardest thing, the thing that you're more thankful for, the greatest blessing, and the advice that you would give for teenagers?
Okay, the hardest part, I think, for me was that even though we had been going to Catholic school, since childhood, we really, what we learned there was not, it was pounded into our minds, but not into our hearts. And so when my mother specifically started, turning my younger sister and I towards the old teachings, it was like nobody ever tried to rein us in before, and really say, this is truth, period. This is the teaching, period. The nuns had never done that to us. It was rote, but it didn't really mean anything, it was memorized words. So there was a lot of interior rebellion there. Okay. One of the things that I've been most grateful for, I have always loved working with children, and I have been able to share that, and hopefully in a productive manner with the young children who I've taught, over the decades. Mm-hmm. I love working with them, and I really try to impart to them the love of the faith, and not just words. And then I would say specifically to the older kids who are now parents, to carry this on with your children, to teach them to learn the faith and love the faith in a family sense, not in a classroom sense, but in a life lesson of living your faith.
Let me get this straight. You were a rebel teenager when you were in school.
One of those kinds that boils on the inside and doesn't really show a lot on the outside.
Those are the best ones. And I think for what you're saying, it's kind of implicit in your advice also that teaching the faith to children is probably one of the most fulfilling things you can do in your life.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
I bet by now you can see some children grown up and be Catholic.
I am teaching some little church songs to the children of my children.
That is so neat. That is so nice.
It's very neat. Very neat.
I really thank you for being with us today. I know it's, as I say in every show, I've only done once, but it's hard to put yourself out there because, I know it's hard. We don't really want to be exposed for other people to listen to what we have to say, maybe perhaps, but I think it's very helpful because I think especially for young people, it's very helpful to see the examples of others, what they live through, and we can learn from the examples of others. And I think that's very important for young generations to see someone else following the faith. It kind of gives you strength. It's not, as you're saying, it's not just something that is, and that's something that I see a lot, in schools. Some kids will only get it in their minds, but they never get it in their hearts. And a lot of times what they need to get it in their hearts is to see someone else out in the open, like sharing their story and seeing who they really are. So I really thank you for this, and I really appreciate it, especially because today we went on a walk through the stores, then we went to the restaurant, and then we walked even more, and we had some ice cream, and we were all tired, I think. So they were kind enough to allow me to interview them while they're here with us for today.
Thank you for listening to the Catholic Wire. If you have found this show helpful, please say a prayer for all our collaborators. Don't forget to subscribe to our channels and share with your friends. For questions and comments, you may contact us at thecatholicwire.org.